So once again, welcome. My name is Venkat Devraj. I'm one of the co-founders of SelectHub, and it's my pleasure to walk you through this webinar today. SelectHub is what we call a technology selection management platform. That's quite a mouthful, so let me take a minute to explain what we mean by it. So by technology, we mean any hardware, software, any IT services, even telephony and telecom purchase that an organization goes through. And when you look at the typical process that organizations follow when going through a selection process and then, doing the sourcing and then doing the contract piece, the process is unlike anything else. It's not like buying commodities or buying office stationery. Technology is a unique animal. And in the past, many organizations have dealt with technology selection and purchases using the standard Word documents, Excel spreadsheets, and e-procurement tools, which are more suited to a different kind of purchase where the value is not as nebulous as technology, where it's easier to look at pricing from multiple vendors, compare them, and let them do a bid. The technology, as we will talk about here, it's a very different animal. A lot of details are not as crisp. Pricing becomes one of the criteria, but perhaps not the most important criteria. So organizations have often developed a variety of devices of their own undertaking to be able to fill the gaps and try and make an intelligent purchase. But unfortunately, as industry statistics show, there is a high failure rate. There are lots of delays and bottlenecks. There are lots of manual parts and pieces when it comes to technology selection and vendor selection, and it becomes a very painful, laborious process. So given this kind of ecosystem that exists, SelectHub, over the last 3 years, we have brought to market a software platform. It's a cloud-based or a software as a service offering that really helps organizations through these processes and puts in place a series of best practices, which is much more painless, much less labor-intensive, much more inclusive. So, and the last but not least, it also delivers a big value in terms of time savings. To give you an idea of the kind of time savings we are talking about, we work with a variety of different organizations, both in the private sector, publicly owned companies, government entities, educational institutions. And the common value, the common denominator that SelectHub brings to the table across all these different industries and organizations is if you take a typical sourcing project or a technology selection project, let's say it takes an average of 3 months. The biggest value is that with SelectHub, you are able to do it in less than half the time. So you will typically see these technology projects being done in a matter of 4 to 6 weeks rather than 3 or 4 months. So it's a magnitude of improvement in terms of the time savings that organizations see. But at the same time, let's drill into this a little bit further. So when you look at typically what organizations go through when it comes to technology selection and purchasing, there are 3 specific problems. Number 1, too many manual, time-consuming processes. Number 2, IT and procurement, both of these groups have limited visibility and control end-to-end. And last but not least, both of these groups, even with the best of intention, they often struggle to keep up, especially since technology is often changing. There are new vendors where none may have existed last year. There are new open source options. There are new solutions and pricing models and features and modules that vendors are constantly releasing. So when you try to do an apples-to-apples comparison, it becomes very difficult. When you turn around and try to be the counsel to the business stakeholders in terms of guiding them through the right selection process without coming across as a policeman, it becomes a real struggle because business often feels like IT and procurement don't get it. And they often go out and buy things on their own, and IT and procurement are the last to know about it. So a lot of these dynamics, often referred to as shadow IT, are real challenges that many organizations struggle with. So the question becomes, how does IT and procurement deliver clear value, tangible value to business stakeholders that are looking to make a technology purchase? So with this kind of issues and challenges, Let's look at a little bit further why these challenges exist. So when I talk about a lot of manual processes that exist in technology selection, sourcing, and procurement, mind you, there are some smart people who have put a lot of good processes within their organization, and the process is not the problem. In fact, at a high level, the process kind of looks like this. There's a lot of commonality in terms of how this process is instituted. So, for instance, when a new requisition comes in, whether it's for a new software, it's a new hardware, it's an IT services engagement, or telephony, telecom, when a new requisition comes in, people get together, typically an IT project manager or a sourcing person or a procurement person will participate with the business stakeholders. They will pull in different stakeholders like IT security, business analysts, architecture, and so on. And people start gathering requirements. Once the requirements are gathered to a comfortable level, they start looking at what are the products out there, what are the vendors out there, what does Gartner have to say, what does Forrester have to say. People do a bunch of research about who the appropriate vendor shortlist might be. Sometimes they have to have a shortlist, but they still have to do an open bid or an open RFI or an RFP, depending on the size of the spend and depending on the scope of the project. And then they may have to request demos, they may do a proof of concept, do a scorecarding internally of the vendors and products and services, and make a final decision and get into the contract part. So the process is fundamentally sound. The challenge comes in when you look at how the process is implemented. A lot of it is email and Word documents and Excel spreadsheets that get bandied about, that get passed around. And a lot of things potentially drop through the cracks. It's very difficult to even figure out simple things like, are the right stakeholders participating? Are the people properly engaged in the process? Are the right requirements coming from everybody? And so on. And as a result, once you have chosen a vendor or a product, there's a lot of second guessing. People are not happy. There's a lot of finger pointing. And even, you often hear things like, who selected this vendor? And unfortunately, a lot of the software purchases end up being shelfware. And that's true even for broader, hardware purchases and other technology purchases. Number two, technology tends to be a very linear evaluation and selection process. It's not uncommon to hear about the VP of marketing who goes out to an industry conference, comes back and tells the IT department, hey guys, we should be going with XYZ vendor because a lot of my peers in the industry are going with their product and it can really help us move the needle in terms of reaching out to customers faster, better, make us a better organization, and so on. And IT and procurement are often brought in at the tail end of that discussion. So they become order takers rather than strategic business partners who are able to engage the VP of marketing or the VP of HR or any of the other business stakeholders and ask the right questions. What are the requirements that's driving this? Have you thought about these 50 other requirements? Have you thought about these vendors who seem to have a better fit in terms of these requirements? So conversations like that become very, very rare. And often IT and procurement go to work figuring out how to make that vendor or product fit into the overall scheme of things. So they don't really have much of a say in the matter. And last but not least, if you look at the flip side of that coin, you can't really blame IT and procurement for being order takers because they really don't have the time to go into details and figure out exactly what are the other vendors that might be a good fit, what are the requirements we should be looking at, what kind of requirements does the industry think about when they look at a project like this. They really don't have a lot of time on their hands because they all have a day job. So take, for example, business intelligence as a sample category. Every company out there seems to have a BI project that's going on. But when the head of marketing comes to IT or procurement and says, hey guys, we need to go with vendor X. Now, suddenly, when you look at a Gartner report or a Forrester report, it kind of looks like this. You see a Magic Quadrant or a Forrester Wave report, or you see there are dozens, sometimes 100 plus vendors in that space. There are different categories and subcategories within BI. So how do you separate the wheat from the chaff? How do you map what the requirements are from marketing to a finite set of vendors and products and services that can really bring value to your organization today? It becomes a very hard task that takes a lot of research and a lot of legwork, which the IT and procurement department doesn't really have. So given these kind of dynamics, how can SelectHub help? So the way SelectHub helps is we have brought two products to the table, or two packages to the table. One is called SelectHub for IT, which is really the technology selection management piece that I talked about at the beginning of this presentation. And the second one is what we call vendor sourcing management. On the left side, the SelectHub for IT, or technology selection management, provides a very prescriptive workflow for the internal stakeholders to go through the requirements process, get some hand-holding, get some guidance about what are the industry standard, in terms of what requirements should we be looking at, what are the vendors, what are the products that meet those requirements, internally scorecarding those capabilities and arriving at a consensus. And the second offering, SelectHub for vendor sourcing, really extends that workflow into the vendor side as well. So within SelectHub, vendors can be onboarded. And typically, if you look at the database today, we have over 2,000 vendors that are represented in our platform. And you can initiate with a push of a button, you can initiate an RFI or an RFP, or even a pre-RFP inquiry, where you can find out what capabilities that does a vendor have. You can request a demo, you can do a proof of concept. So all of those things you can do with a vendor community using the second offering. And it's free for vendors. Vendors have their own portal. And any evaluation you do, it's all confidential. And vendors don't know about it unless you initiate a new RFI or an RFP, and they can be invited to participate in that. One last thing, you also have a full audit trail. So as the workflow, you start using the product and you go through the selection process, you go through the shortlisting process, you go through the RFI or the RFP and the contract, you are able to gather a complete audit trail. So if there is a future problem, there is a liability issue, you can always go back and look at the data. And more importantly, sometimes you can reuse a lot of your best practices from one project to the other. And we will talk about how you can do all that much more effectively. And there is one more thing. So when you look at this workflow, one of the ways SelectHub helps you with a third problem we talked about, which is technology landscape is very nebulous, a lot of moving parts, lots of vendors, not a lot of clear research, not a lot of current research. The way SelectHub solves that problem is within the workflow that I talked about, we have layered a lot of subject matter expertise or domain knowledge. And what we do is, for instance, we offer a library of requirements templates across 100 different categories. So let's say you're starting a new project for a customer relationship management or a new telecom project or a new IT services vendor you're looking for, you can press a button and get access to the top 50, top 100, top 200 requirements that you should be thinking about. And it gives your team a flying start. So you're not starting from scratch. You're able to look at SelectHub's templates and you're able to cherry pick the requirements which are relevant for your organization and your project. Similarly, you can look at a typical vendor scorecard or leaderboard and look at the top 5, top 10 vendors that meet many of the requirements that are relevant in the industry for this category, and you're able to separate the wheat from the chaff. So instead of looking at 40, 50 vendors that may have appeared in a Gartner report or a Forrester report, you can go a lot deeper, you can go a lot more granular, and you're able to map what requirements are relevant and with what vendors and products best meet those requirements. So that's in a nutshell how we bring value. A prescriptive workflow with subject matter expertise layered in, which allows you to go through soup to nuts, that entire selection, vendor shortlisting, sourcing process with end-to-end visibility. All right, enough talk. Let's go into the product and get a feel for how everything is laid out. And in the meantime, if you have any questions, if you have any comments, please feel free to type them in the chat window, and I'll periodically keep an eye on it. If you have any questions, we can either address them as we go along here, or after this session, we will be sure to have some Q&A time so we can address your questions at that time as well. Okay, so here I am. I have logged into a demo environment, and I see that there is a simple dashboard here. There is a help screen right here. And down below, I see a list of projects that, and when I say project, what I really mean is a selection event or a sourcing event. So depending on which side of the fence you are, if you're in IT, think of it as a technology selection project, a very specialized type of project, or if you're a sourcing or procurement person, it's a sourcing event, basically. So you can see some of the sample projects here. Most of them are technology specific. Some of our customers also use SelectHub for non-technology sourcing events. For example, here's a travel services RFI that's going on. So let's kind of look at how everything is laid out. The first thing is there are 3 tabs. So besides these projects, I also see access to some scorecards that my colleagues may have created. I also see some templates which my team has created. It allows us to reuse the requirements from one project to another without having to rely on Word documents and Excel spreadsheets and email. So everything is right here. Now, there is also an executive dashboard here, which gives me a lot more high-level metrics. It helps me understand problems and issues that may exist in some of these projects, so I can step in and manage by exception without having to get deep into every project. I can also create a brand new technology selection project right here by clicking on this green button. Let's jump into one of these projects. Here is a CRM evaluation project. CRM, of course, is short for Customer Relationship Management. So when I click on this project, the first thing I'm taken to is a project dashboard. And here again, I see a help screen. So the product is meant to be very intuitive. It's almost like using Facebook or LinkedIn. Doesn't need a lot of training, but there is always help. So you know what you need to do, step 1, step 2, step 3, and so on. Now, I'm going to put the help away for right now. So when I look at the project overview screen, I see a snapshot of everything that's going on inside this project. For example, there are about 468 requirements that have come in across different groups, different departments, different business teams. I see that there are about 10 products or vendors that have been shortlisted for this particular project. There are 5 scorecards that have been done, 12 RFIs, RFQs, RFPs that have been done, 3 proof of concepts that have been initiated. So I get to see everything that's going on, recent project activity, who are the stakeholders, and so on. If I want to see more detailed history, I can always click on the history button, and it will tell me who did what, who added what requirement, who shortlisted which vendor. So all of that information is right here. And tomorrow there is a legal issue or whatever, I can always go back and demonstrate that everything was done in a fair manner without any vendor partiality, without influencing or giving any vendor any advantage. Everything was done above the board. So it becomes very easy for me. And we keep all this history data for a minimum of 7 years. So you can always go back in time. So from a compliance perspective, from a governance perspective, it's great to have all this information at your fingertips. All right. So now that I have this project, the first thing I'm going to do is make sure the right stakeholders are participating in this project. So as you can see here, there are quite a few people that are invited in this project. So I've got somebody from the sales team, I've got somebody from the marketing team, and let's say I would like to have somebody from the delivery team join. I can click on their name and I can give them a certain role. The role dictates what they can or cannot do. For example, if you have the role of a project participant, you can add requirements, you can add vendor recommendations to your project, you can shortlist additional products and vendors, but that's it. You cannot communicate with those vendors. You cannot reach out to those vendors. You cannot initiate a new RFI or an RFP, but you can do all of the latter if you have the procurement officer role. So each of these roles can be customized. They can be added. You can add additional roles if you want. It's all configurable based on your policies and procedures and your titles and roles that you have within your organization. Okay, now that I have got the right stakeholders participating, the next thing I have to do is start gathering requirements. So I'm going to click on the Requirements tab. And within the Requirements tab, I am able to see exactly, what are the requirements that have come in so far. So I start out by choosing a particular category. So let's say there is a big data project going on, there is a DR project going on, there is a business intelligence project going on, there is a networking project going on, there is an IT security project, or I'm looking for an IT services vendor or a marketing automation product. So there are so many different categories and subcategories. We have coverage for well over 100 different technology categories. You can also create a custom category. Some of our customers use this to do a build versus buy analysis. They may not do an actual RFI or an RFP, but they gather requirements, they get input from everybody, and they see whether they should build it internally. And if so, they funnel these requirements to an internal app dev team. But if they decide, they want to buy a solution, they start going to the next level, which is researching the products and doing potentially an RFI or an RFP. And all of that can be done regardless of the direction you choose through SelectHub. So for the purpose of this demo, I'm going to choose Customer Relationship Management, or CRM, as the category. Now, as soon as I choose the category, a couple of things start to happen. Number one, a lot of the requirements that are relevant for this project start to come in. Now, the question is, where do the requirements come from? There are a couple of sources where the requirements can come from. One is from SelectHub itself. So I mentioned that we have a library of requirements templates across these 100+ categories. So when I have chosen CRM, I can drill down and see what categories of templates does SelectHub have. So there is a CRM template. There are some associated templates like risk management, compliance. And if I want to understand what some of these requirements are, whether these requirements are relevant for my project or not, I can choose that template and I can click on the preview button. And immediately it opens up a read-only view of that template. And I can scroll through all the requirements and see if these are relevant for my organization. If not, I can go to a different template. But if these are requirements that are relevant, all I have to do is click on the red button that says import, and automatically all of those requirements, those 50, 100, 200 requirements, show up within my project. And that's what gives me that flying start. So I'm no longer left to my own devices to gather all these requirements and get these busy stakeholders to engage in my project and to start providing input, providing input. So I can give them, hey, look, here are some sample requirements. What do you guys think about this? So it gives me a terrific start. Once I have imported these requirements, I can add my own requirements if I want. I can edit these requirements. I can customize them. And I can also prioritize them. So every stakeholder at the table has a voice in the process. So everybody can say, look, finance can say this is a low priority for me, whereas IT security can say this is a high priority for me. And if you have comments and questions and things like that, you can get into a conversation right there. And you also see an audit trail of how the priority of this requirement has changed. But when you're going through these requirements, if you want to understand how have different people rated it, there is a section called Team Priority. And all I have to do is take my cursor over there, and it shows me that Joe from finance gave this a high priority, Stephen from marketing gave this a low priority, and so on. And I can also see who has not contributed their input so far. So for example, let's say David, one of the stakeholders in this example, has not voted. And let's say he's our IT security person, and we really need his input before we can take this to the vendors and do an RFI. Well, rather than bombarding everybody with emails and phone calls, I can quickly use the calendaring function to say, I need everybody's input by the 24th of this week, of this month, and by 5 p.m., and automatically the system, just like Facebook or LinkedIn, will send out notifications to people and say, look, you have 72 hours remaining, you have 48 hours remaining to provide your input. So it becomes an easy way for me to, orchestrate this entire process, get everybody to participate. And once I have everybody's input, the next step is I can start shortlisting vendors and products based on the requirements that have come in. Now, I can also export these out into an Excel if I want to work on it in Excel. Some people are very comfortable working with Excel. Or I can also create my own template. So many times when going from one project to the other, I often, you may find that there are 20, 30 requirements from finance that always is needed for any software project or any hardware project. Similarly, IT security or compliance may have 20, 30 requirements of their own that they would like to have automatically represented in every project. So one of the beautiful things about SelectHub is I can go to the dashboard and I can create my own template, whether it's an architectural template, whether it's a performance-related template, whether it's a finance-related template. So I create a template by giving it a name, a description. I can make it a public template or a private template. And if it's a private template, it's only available for users within my organization. Whereas if it's a public template, I can share it with other companies in my industry, within the community. So if there are, let's say I'm a government entity, and I want to share this with other government institutions, or I am, let's say, an educational institution or financial services institution, I can share it with other companies. Or if I'm not comfortable sharing that, if everything is pristine, everything is confidential for my organization, I can build this template and mark it as private. And in that case, it's completely confidential and it's only available for users pertaining to your organization. Now, I can also choose to make it mandatory. So from a governance perspective, if I want my 20, 30, 40 requirements to show up automatically without manually incorporating it in every project, I can mark it as mandatory. So anytime someone creates a project, whether it's a software or a hardware or a telecom category, I can link it to the appropriate categories. Those requirements automatically get imported. So makes it very easy, very reusable. All right. Now that I have the requirements in place, the next step is to figure out what is everybody's input, what are the products, what are the vendors we should be shortlisting. So if someone says, look, I have used SAP in my previous job, we should really be going with them, or the IT department is saying we should look at Oracle because we are an Oracle shop, or the VP of marketing is saying, no, you know what, guys, NetSuite is the way to go because all of my peers are using it. Well, everybody can chime in. Everybody can make a recommendation based on their individual experience. But if you would like to have more data, you can always go to the SelectHub leaderboard. So for example, with CRM, we have these leaderboards across 100 plus different categories. But let's take the CRM example here. So you can say, look, we are not sure what products might be a good fit. We have looked at, Gartner reports. We have looked at, done a bunch of Google searches. We are not entirely sure. So the SelectHub leaderboard gives you a flying start. So on the left side, you can see all of these requirements that are relevant, in our requirements template. And on the right side, you see all the vendors and products that might be a good fit. And each of these vendors is given a composite rating based on their individual capabilities and how well they meet each individual requirement. But if I have a question, why is vendor X given 50 versus 100 when it comes to contact management as an example? I can take my cursor to the contact management and there is a description of what that requirement is all about. I can also click on expand and include comments and see what the SelectHub analyst team is telling me. So all of that information is right here, why a vendor was given XYZ rating for a particular capability. So it becomes largely self-service. You're not having to bring in an expensive consultant and try to get all this information. But if you would like to have a consultant, the consultant can use this too, and this can be a common tool that your organization uses and the consultant uses to keep everybody on the same page. Now, granted that, with all this information, you may agree with some of these assessments. You may say, look, I need more information. So one of the things that SelectHub lets you do is you can go into the vendor database, into the supplier database, and these are all pre-qualified suppliers. Everybody's given a rating and a ranking based on the category. It's not a generic supplier database like an Ariba or a SideQuest or any of the products, which are great products, by the way, for generic sourcing, generic procurement. But when it comes to IT and you're missing, that pre-qualification, that subject matter expertise, which vendor meets what criteria, what requirement, the SelectHub tool augments those products. So when you come to, if you have questions about what the vendor's capabilities are, you can look at the SelectHub scorecard, get a starting point, but then go into the product directory, click on a vendor name that you might be interested in having a conversation, click on contact vendor, and you can type in your question right there. So for example, let's say I have a question around, does this vendor support integration to SAP, right? That could be a question that you have. Or let's say you have a question about, does this vendor, does this product, support Internet Explorer? So I can put the question right here, do you integrate with SAP? And I don't want to get into some vendor database because it might be too premature for the vendor to know who I am. So I can choose to remove my name, my title, and only share my company name, or I can be completely anonymous. And I remember I mentioned there's a vendor portal. So when I send these questions based on my role, I'm able to send these questions out to the vendors. The vendors get a notification, and the vendor representative logs into the vendor portal. They're able to respond to the query, and you don't have to worry about chasing vendors down, figuring out who's the right salesperson to reach out to, going into some, weird, third-party email form and filling out your information. None of that. You put in your information here in terms of what you're comfortable with. You put in your question, and you hit the submit button, and you start seeing responses right here. Now, if you like the response from the vendor, what you can do is you can shortlist them to your project. That's it. That takes care of preparing a list of vendors that you would like to include in the RFI or the RFP. You can request demos from any of these vendors. So here's how it works. So you see here, there's a POC module. It's also the module where you can request demos from some of these vendors, all of these vendors. There's a scorecard where after you have seen a demo or done a proof of concept, you can build out a scorecard. You can poll everybody, all the stakeholders, and say, what did you think about vendor A versus vendor B? All of that can be done through SelectHub. Makes it a very transparent, very consensus-driven process. You can also initiate an RFI or an RFP at the press of a button. Now, I'm going to take 5 minutes and show you how you can initiate a new RFI or RFP. And there are two kinds of RFIs, RFPs. One is an open RFI or RFP, which many of our government customers take advantage of, where you may not know or by law you are prohibited from reaching out to specific vendors. So you may have to publish an open RFP, and any vendor that decides to participate in it should be able to. So that we call an open RFX. Or you can do a closed RFX where you choose to invite only certain vendors. So SelectHub supports both of these processes. So I'll give you a couple of data points. The first thing you do when you create an RFI or RFP is you choose, if you would like to, what vendors you would like to have participate. Or if you don't want to include that, you want to make it open, you don't include any vendors. But let's say for the purpose of this demo, I would like to have Oracle, I would like to have NetSuite, I would like to have Salesforce or Sugar CRM participate in this. I choose whether I would like them to sign an NDA or not. I choose what information I want to share with them. Do I want to share the project dates? Do I want to share the project goals? Do I want to share the company name? What other instructions I want to give them? So I put in some basic information. Then I start building my actual RFI or RFP. And remember all those requirements that we put in. With a simple click, I can import all of them. No more copying and pasting things from Word and Excel. And I can build my set of questions. I can build my set of requirements for this RFI, RFP. I can also edit it. I can say, look, I want the vendor to choose from a yes-no answer. I want the vendor to choose from these options only. So I can customize how this RFX should be sent to the vendors and how they can respond through SelectHub. So once I have set up all the ground rules, I can preview the RFX and I can hit the submit button and send it to the vendors. Now, what happens is that the vendors get the notification that, look, you have got a new RFX that has come in through SelectHub. Do you wish to participate? And if they wish to participate, and let's say they have some questions, there is a public Q&A section where they can ask questions, and vendor A does not know that vendor B is asking that question. That information is kept confidential. But the vendor's question and your response can be forwarded to all the vendors that are participating. Make this an easy, a fair process. Number two, when the vendor responses start to come in, you can start seeing that what the responses are, and SelectHub is giving an auto rating to each of the responses, each of the vendors, based on the quality of the responses. And you can edit those, the rating and the ranking. Every stakeholder who has the authority can override the rating, and SelectHub will show you an average of how the vendor has been rated or ranked. So again, you're going from requirements gathering all the way to vendor shortlisting, all the way to an RFI or an RFP, and there's a complete paper trail. Everything is held in a central repository, so you can reuse best practices as well as get a complete view of what's going on. And in the meantime, if your CIO or your CFO or a marketing head is coming and saying, hey guys, what's going on with the selection process? Well, they don't have to kind of worry about why the delay is. They can get access to a scorecard like this. You can share this with them. You can show them that, look, here's the process we ran. Here's the RFI or the RFP we ran. Here are the vendor responses. And here's how our internal stakeholders have rated or ranked them. And you are welcome to rate them yourself. So it becomes, again, a very collaborative process. And all you got to do is hit the share button and share it with those colleagues who may be wondering about the status of these projects. So one last thing is, when you're going through the responses from the various vendors, you may have some question. Let's say the pricing information is not clear, the proposal terms are not clear, or you have some questions about some discounts they're offering. Well, you don't have to come outside the system. You can click on the discuss with vendor. It opens up a private discussion between your organization and the vendor, and the other vendors don't know it, right? It's still a competitive process. And you can go into more details about, hey, vendor, can you give me some information about this pricing? Do you have any additional discounts? And you can also get into contract red lines. All the contracts can go back and forth. And all of those conversations become part of the audit trail. And once you have negotiated the contract, everything is clear, and you're ready to sign it, you can get the signature done. We integrate with e-signature solutions. You can attach the contract right here so that everything is there in one place. And you can also go to the products and say that, look, this is the vendor we decided to award the contract to. So you can mark the vendor as a final solution, and you can notify the other vendors that, hey guys, thanks for participating, but we have decided to go with a different vendor. Thank you very much. So that's kind of the process in a nutshell that you go through within SelectHub. So let me quickly summarize. The three problems that we solve are, number one, the manual steps, the laborious process of identifying requirements, shortlisting vendors and shortlisting products, going through an RFI, RFP, going through all the individual vendor responses. Everything is streamlined into a prescriptive workflow. Everything's streamlined into an end-to-end database, and you have access to that database. You have full visibility to that database, and the audit trail gives you that end-to-end visibility. And last but not least, SelectHub has brought in all this knowledge, this domain knowledge out of the box. It's all layered in a meaningful way within the workflow. So you're able to get access to the requirements templates, the vendor leaderboards, helping you jumpstart the project and saving you weeks of time. So that's in a nutshell what SelectHub is all about. And now is a good